The snow was falling heavy on Christmas Eve when I stood at my daughter Sarah's front door, holding the wrapped presents I'd bought for my grandchildren. I could hear laughter and warmth coming from inside the house I'd helped her buy 3 years ago. When Sarah finally opened the door, her face went cold the moment she saw me. "Dad, what are you doing here? I told you we were having Christmas with Mark's parents this year." Behind her, I could see her husband, Mark, rolling his eyes, and his parents sitting comfortably on the couch I'd helped them pick out when they first moved in. I held up the gifts, my breath visible in the frigid air. "I just wanted to drop these off for the kids. I won't stay long, sweetheart. Maybe just say hello to Emma and Jake?" That's when Sarah said the words that would slice through my heart like a knife. "Dad, you're nothing but a burden. We don't have room for you anymore. Mark's parents are staying in the guest room, and frankly, we need space from your constant neediness. You can't keep showing up here expecting us to take care of you." I stood there in the freezing cold, watching my own daughter's face twist with embarrassment as her in-laws looked on from the living room. Mark stepped up behind her, placing his hand on her shoulder like he was protecting her from me. "Sarah's right, Robert. You need to understand boundaries. We have our own family priorities now." The gifts suddenly felt heavier in my hands. These weren't just any presents. I'd spent weeks picking out the perfect dollhouse for Emma and the remote control car Jake had been talking about all year. I'd used money from my pension. Money I'd been carefully saving despite the financial help I'd been quietly providing them. "I understand," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll just leave these on the porch." "Actually," Sarah said, her voice getting sharper, "we'd prefer if you didn't. The kids are expecting gifts from Santa, and we don't want to confuse them with random presents from someone who isn't really part of our Christmas plans." The words hit me harder than the December wind cutting through my coat. Someone who isn't really part of their Christmas plans. This was the same daughter I'd raised alone after her mother died when she was 12. The same girl I'd worked double shifts to put through college. The same woman whose mortgage payment of $2,247 had been automatically deducted from my account every single month for the past 3 years. Mark's mother's voice drifted from the living room. "Is everything all right out there? It's getting cold with the door open." "Everything's fine, Mrs. Peterson," Sarah called back sweetly, then turned back to me with that same cold expression. "Dad, you really need to go. We're about to sit down for dinner, and you're making everyone uncomfortable." I looked past her one more time, hoping to catch a glimpse of my grandchildren, but they were nowhere to be seen. Probably upstairs, blissfully unaware that their grandfather was being turned away on Christmas Eve like some unwanted stranger. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," I said, turning away with the rejected gifts still in my arms. As I walked back to my car, I heard the door slam shut behind me, followed by the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place. The porch light went off a few seconds later, leaving me standing in the darkness of the snowy driveway. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the warm glow from their windows, wondering how it had come to this. How had I become such a burden to the family I'd sacrificed everything for? But as I drove away that night, I had no idea that tomorrow morning would bring a phone call that would change everything. The humiliation didn't end with that slammed door on Christmas Eve. 3 days later, I found myself standing in the checkout line at Peterson's hardware store, the same place I'd been shopping for 30 years. I was buying a new lock for my front door when I heard familiar voices behind me. "Oh my God, is that him?" It was Mark's voice, barely attempting to whisper. I turned around to see Mark and his parents standing 2 people behind me in line, their cart full of post-Christmas return items. Mark's father, Douglas Peterson, was staring at me with obvious disdain. "That's Sarah's father," Mark continued, his voice carrying enough for several people to hear. "The one I told you about. He showed up unannounced on Christmas Eve, completely inappropriate. Sarah had to practically throw him out." "Mrs. Wernge." Peterson shook her head sympathetically. "How awful for you both. Some elderly people just don't understand boundaries anymore. They become so needy and demanding." I felt my face burning with embarrassment as other customers started glancing in my direction. The teenage cashier was taking her time with the customer in front of me, and I was trapped listening to them tear apart my character in public. Sarah told me he's been getting worse lately, Mark said, his voice getting louder. Constantly calling, showing up uninvited, expecting them to drop everything for him. She's worried he's becoming one of those clingy, dependent parents who can't let their adult children live their own lives. Douglas Peterson nodded knowingly. We've seen it before. When people don't have enough going on in their own lives, they become parasites on their children's happiness. Sarah's lucky she has you to protect her from that kind of emotional manipulation. The word parasite hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the counter, trying to stay composed as more people in the store began to listen to their conversation. These were my neighbors, people I'd known for years, and now they were hearing me described as some pathetic, clingy burden. The worst part, Mrs. Peterson added, is how these dependent parents often guilt-trip their children with stories about all the sacrifices they made, as if raising your own child is some kind of favor you're owed repayment for. I finally reached the cashier, my hand shaking slightly as I handed over my credit card. The young girl looked at me with what I could only describe as pity, clearly having overheard the entire conversation. "Have a good day, sir," she said softly, her eyes full of sympathy for the sad old man everyone was talking about. As I walked toward the exit, I heard Mark's final comment. Sarah's just relieved she finally found the courage to set boundaries. She said it's like a weight has been lifted off her shoulders. I pushed through the front door into the cold January air, knowing that by tomorrow, half the neighborhood would have heard some version of this story. In their minds, I was now officially the needy, clingy father who couldn't accept that his daughter had moved on with her life. But they had no idea what Sarah was about to discover. That night, sitting alone in my living room with the humiliation from the hardware store still burning in my chest, I found myself staring at the photo on my mantelpiece. It was Sarah's college graduation day, her smile bright as she held her diploma. She had no idea that I'd just finished paying off the last of her student loans that morning, using the money I'd been saving for my own retirement. As I looked at that picture, the memories came flooding back like a dam had burst. Sarah was only 12 when her mother, Linda, died in that car accident. One moment we were a complete family, and the next, I was a widowed father trying to figure out how to raise a teenage girl on my own. I remembered those early days after Linda's death, when Sarah would wake up screaming from nightmares. I'd hold her until she fell back asleep, then lie awake the rest of the night wondering if I was doing anything right. I gave up dating, gave up my social life, gave up everything that wasn't about being the father she needed. When she turned 16 and wanted to join the debate team, I picked up weekend shifts at the factory so I could afford the travel expenses for tournaments. When other kids had both parents cheering them on, I made sure to be loud enough for 2 people. I drove to every single competition, sometimes 4 hours each way, sleeping in my car in parking lots to save money on hotels. College was when the real sacrifices began. Sarah got into State University, but even with financial aid, we were looking at massive expenses. I took out a second mortgage on the house Linda and I had almost paid off. I worked overtime every week for 4 years, missing dinners, missing sleep, missing life, just to keep the checks coming. I remembered the night she called me, crying because she wanted to study abroad in London for a semester. The program cost $15,000 we didn't have. I hung up the phone and stared at Linda's wedding ring, the one I'd never been able to bring myself to remove from the jewelry box. The next morning, I sold it along with her other jewelry. I never told Sarah where the money came from. When she graduated and couldn't find work right away, I quietly paid her rent for 8 months. When she met Mark and they got engaged, I paid for half the wedding, even though Mark's family had 3 times the money we did. I just wanted my daughter to have everything she deserved. The house they live in now, the one they threw me out of on Christmas Eve, that was supposed to be my retirement dream. Linda and I had picked out the lot together 20 years ago, planning to build there when we got older. Instead, when Sarah and Mark couldn't qualify for a mortgage on their teachers' salaries, I bought that house and put it in their names. For 3 years, I'd been paying their mortgage while living in my small apartment across town. Every month, $2,847 automatically came out of my account. Sarah thought Mark's promotion had made it affordable. Mark thought Sarah's family money was handling it. Neither of them knew that their deadbeat, clingy burden of a father was the reason they had a roof over their heads. I closed my eyes and wondered what Linda would think of the daughter we'd raised together. 2 weeks after the hardware store humiliation, I learned just how deep the knife had been twisted. My neighbor Helen knocked on my door that Sunday afternoon, her face full of concern and what looked like reluctance. "Robert, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say this gently." She shifted uncomfortably on my doorstep. I ran into Sarah at the grocery store yesterday, and we got to talking. I invited her in, already sensing this wasn't going to be good news. Helen had been Linda's closest friend and had watched Sarah grow up. If anyone would tell me the truth, it would be her. "She told me some things about your relationship that honestly shocked me," Helen continued, settling into the chair across from my couch. "According to Sarah, she says you've been emotionally manipulative for years." The words hit me like ice water. What exactly did she say? Helen looked pained but continued. "She claims that after Linda died, you became overly dependent on her emotionally, that you made her feel responsible for your happiness instead of letting her grieve properly. She said you guilt-tripped her into staying close to home for college instead of going to her first-choice school." I stared at Helen in disbelief. Sarah's first choice had been an expensive private college 3 states away. I'd spent hours with her, helping her understand that State University had an excellent program and would leave her debt-free. She'd agreed it was the smarter choice. We'd made that decision together. "There's more," Helen said quietly. "She told me that you've been using money as a way to control her decisions, that every time she tries to establish independence, you swoop in with financial help that comes with emotional strings attached." My mouth went dry. Financial strings? I'd never asked for anything in return for helping her, not once. "She said that's why she had to cut contact, because you were making Mark uncomfortable by constantly inserting yourself into their marriage with unsolicited advice and financial manipulation." Helen's voice got softer. "Robert, she said you told her that Mark wasn't good enough for her and that you'd been trying to break them up." This was complete fiction. I'd welcomed Mark into the family from day one, even when I noticed how he seemed to look down on my blue-collar background. I'd bitten my tongue when he made condescending comments about my job at the factory. I'd smiled and nodded when he corrected my grammar at family dinners. "And the final thing," Helen continued, her eyes full of sympathy. "She said that you've been telling people around town that you're supporting them financially, which is embarrassing for them as a young couple trying to build their independence." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Supporting them financially? I wasn't telling anyone anything. I was the one keeping it secret, protecting their pride by letting everyone think they were making it on their own. "She showed me text messages," Helen added reluctantly, "where she says you were demanding to spend Christmas with them and got angry when they said they wanted to start their own traditions with Mark's family." Now I was truly stunned. I'd never demanded anything. I'd simply asked if I could drop off gifts for my grandchildren. The text messages must have been edited or taken completely out of context. Helen reached over and patted my hand. "Robert, I've known you for 20 years. This doesn't sound like the man who raised Sarah after Linda died, but I wanted you to hear it from me rather than from someone else, because this story is spreading around town pretty quickly." After Helen left, I sat in my living room as the reality sank in. Sarah hadn't just cut me out of her life. She'd systematically rewritten our entire history, painting me as a manipulative, controlling father who'd been using money and guilt to manage her life. She'd turned every sacrifice I'd made into evidence of my selfishness. And somehow, she'd convinced herself this version was true. After Helen's revelation about the false narrative spreading through town, something inside me shifted. the hurt was still there, burning like acid in my chest, but alongside it came something else. A cold, calculating clarity I hadn't felt since my days in the Army 30 years ago. I made a decision that night. No more phone calls to Sarah. No more text messages asking about the grandchildren. No more dropping by unannounced with gifts or help. If my daughter wanted to paint me as a manipulative burden, then she was about to discover what life looked like without her so-called burden around. The first test came 3 days later when my phone rang at 7 a.m. It was Sarah, and for a split second my heart jumped with hope. Maybe she'd realized what she'd done. Maybe she was calling to apologize. "Dad, Emma has a dance recital next Saturday at 2 p.m. at the community center. I know things have been tense between us, but she specifically asked if Grandpa Robert would be there. The old me would have dropped everything, would have rearranged my entire week if necessary, would have shown up early with flowers and stayed late to tell Emma how proud I was. Instead, I found myself saying, 'I'll have to check my schedule and get back to you.'" There was a pause on the other end. Sarah clearly wasn't expecting that response. "Your schedule? Dad, what could you possibly have going on that's more important than Emma's recital?" The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. Even when she was asking for my help, she couldn't resist reminding me how small and unimportant my life was supposed to be. "I'll let you know," I repeated and hung up. I never called her back. Over the next few weeks, I watched my phone light up with increasingly frustrated messages. Mark needed help moving furniture for Sarah's new home office. Could I come over Saturday morning? I didn't respond. Sarah's car was making a strange noise, and the mechanic wanted $800 for repairs. Did I know anyone who could take a look at it cheaper? I deleted the message. The most telling call came on a Tuesday evening. Sarah's voice was strained, almost panicked. "Dad, I don't know what's wrong with you lately, but your behavior is really concerning. Mark thinks you might be having some kind of mental health crisis because you're not returning our calls. We're worried about you." I almost laughed at that one. They were worried about me. Not because they missed me or felt guilty about how they'd treated me, but because their reliable safety net wasn't responding to their request for help. Meanwhile, I began making my own plans. I cleaned out the spare bedroom that had been full of Sarah's childhood belongings, things she'd never bothered to come get after moving out 15 years ago. I donated most of it to charity, keeping only a few photos and Linda's jewelry. I started going to the gym again, something I'd given up years ago when every spare minute was devoted to helping Sarah with one crisis or another. I reconnected with old friends from work, guys I'd lost touch with because I was always too busy being the dependable father and grandfather. Most importantly, I scheduled a meeting with my financial advisor and my lawyer. If my family thought I was nothing but a burden, then it was time to stop carrying weight that wasn't mine to bear. The hardest part was driving past their house and seeing the lights on, knowing my grandchildren were inside, probably wondering why Grandpa Robert had disappeared from their lives. But Sarah had made her choice. She wanted independence from her manipulative father. She was about to get more independence than she'd ever imagined. The meeting with my lawyer, Tom Bradley, took place on a cold February morning. I'd brought 3 boxes of documents, bank statements, and records that told the real story of my relationship with Sarah. Tom had been Linda's lawyer too, handling our wills and the house paperwork years ago, so he knew our family history. "Robert, I have to ask," Tom said, spreading the mortgage documents across his desk. "Does Sarah know you're the one making these payments?" I shook my head. "She thinks Mark's promotion covered it. Mark thinks her family money is handling it. Neither one of them has bothered to ask the other about the details." Tom whistled low as he reviewed the bank statements showing 3 years of automatic payments. "That's over $100,000 you've paid on their behalf. And this life insurance policy naming Sarah as beneficiary?" $250,000, I confirmed. "I've been paying the premium since she turned 18. He pulled out another file. "And you have documentation of all the other financial support? College tuition, wedding expenses, car repairs?" I nodded toward the boxes. Every receipt, every bank transfer, every check. Linda always said to keep good records. My voice caught slightly saying her name. I never thought I'd need them to protect myself from my own daughter. Tom leaned back in his chair. Robert, legally speaking, you have complete control here. The house deed shows you as the actual owner with them listed as residents. You can terminate this arrangement at any time with 30 days' notice. The power of that statement hit me like lightning. For months, I'd felt helpless, like a burden being pushed out of my daughter's life. But the truth was, I held all the cards. I just hadn't realized I was playing a game. There's something else, Tom continued, pulling out a folder I hadn't seen before. I did some research after you called. Your daughter and son-in-law have been telling people around town that they're financially independent. Mark even bragged to his golf buddies about affording that house on a teacher's salary. He handed me a printed email. This is from the Rotary Club newsletter. Mark wrote an article about young couples building success through hard work and smart budgeting. He specifically mentions how they bought their dream home without any family assistance. Reading Mark's words about their financial independence and smart planning felt like being slapped. He was taking credit for my sacrifices while simultaneously calling me a burden behind my back. Tom gathered the documents into neat stacks. I'll prepare the legal notices you requested. 30-day termination of the mortgage arrangement, transfer of property deed, and documentation of all financial support provided. If they want to claim independence, we'll give them exactly that. As I left Tom's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. Not the petty desire for revenge, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have options. Sarah and Mark had spent so much energy painting me as weak and dependent that they'd never considered what would happen if their foundation disappeared. They were about to learn that their manipulative, clingy burden had been holding up their entire world. 3 days after my meeting with Tom Bradley, I was sitting in Murphy's Diner picking at my usual Tuesday breakfast when someone slid into the booth across from me. I looked up to see Janet Coleman, Sarah's old high school English teacher, holding a cup of coffee and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. Robert, I hope you don't mind me joining you, but I've been wanting to talk to you for weeks. Janet had been more than just Sarah's teacher. She'd been a mentor, almost a second mother figure after Linda died. Sarah had stayed in touch with her through college and beyond, often crediting Janet with inspiring her to become a teacher herself. Of course not, I said, though I braced myself for another conversation about my supposed failures as a father. Instead, Janet leaned forward and said quietly, I need you to know that not everyone in this town believes the story that's been going around about you. I nearly choked on my coffee. You know about that. Robert, I've been teaching high school for 35 years. I've seen every kind of family dynamic you can imagine, and I've watched parents sacrifice everything for their children only to be thrown away when it's convenient. Her voice carried a steel I remembered from her classroom. What Sarah's been saying about you doesn't match the man I watched raise that girl. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of letters. Do you remember these? I recognized them immediately. They were the letters I'd written to Janet during Sarah's senior year, asking for advice about college applications, scholarship opportunities, and how to help Sarah navigate her teenage grief over losing her mother. Every single letter shows a father desperate to do right by his daughter, Janet continued. A man asking for help, not trying to control. A parent willing to sacrifice his own dreams to give his child every opportunity. She spread one of the letters open on the table. My own handwriting stared back at me. Janet, I'm worried I'm not enough for her. She needs a mother's guidance and I'm just fumbling through. How do I help her heal from losing Linda while still being strong enough to take care of her? This doesn't sound like manipulation to me, Janet said firmly. This sounds like love. I felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks. She's convinced everyone that I was controlling her, using money to manipulate her decisions. Janet shook her head. I was there when she got that acceptance letter from State University. She was over the moon, Robert. She called it her dream school. She told me she was excited to stay close to home because she wanted to take care of her dad who had given up everything for her. The words hit me like a revelation. Sarah had been happy with her choice. She'd wanted to stay close. When had that memory been rewritten? "There's something else," Janet said, lowering her voice. "I still keep in touch with several of Sarah's college friends. According to them, she used to brag constantly about having the most supportive father in the world. She told them you worked extra shifts to pay for her spring break trips. She showed off photos of the car you bought for her graduation." Janet reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever's happened to change her perspective, it's not based on the truth I witnessed. You were an extraordinary father, and anyone with eyes could see how much that girl adored you." She stood up to leave, then turned back one more time. "Robert, I don't know what you're planning to do about this situation, but I want you to know that when the truth comes out, you'll have people in your corner. Real friends don't abandon someone based on gossip." As she walked away, I sat there staring at my own words from 15 years ago, wondering how the daughter who'd once called me her hero had decided I was her burden. But now I knew I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The call from my bank came on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:15 a.m. I'd been expecting it, but hearing the automated message still sent a chill down my spine. "This is First National Bank. Your automatic mortgage payment of $2,847 scheduled for today has been canceled per your request. Please contact us if you have any questions." I'd made the decision 3 days earlier, sitting in my kitchen with Tom Bradley's legal documents spread across the table. The 30-day termination notice had been hand-delivered to Sarah and Mark's house while they were at work, left with their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who signed for it. By law, they had been properly notified that their free ride was ending. But I knew they hadn't opened the envelope yet. Sarah had a habit of leaving mail in a pile on the kitchen counter for days, especially if it looked like legal paperwork. Mark probably assumed it was some kind of insurance or warranty document and ignored it completely. So when my phone rang that evening, I was ready. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was shaky, confused. "I just got the strangest call from the bank. They said our mortgage payment was returned for insufficient funds, but that's impossible. The payment comes out automatically every month." I sat in my recliner, Linda's photo on the side table next to me, and felt calmer than I had in months. "Did you check with Mark? Maybe there was a problem with your account." "That's the weird thing," Sarah continued, her voice getting more agitated. "Mark says he's never set up any automatic payments. He thought the money was coming from my account. But Dad, I don't have that kind of money. I'm a teacher." I let the silence hang for a moment. "That is strange. The bank said the payments have been coming from an account ending in 7429 for the past 3 years. Dad, that's not our account number. Do you think someone's been paying our mortgage by mistake?" Another pause. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "Sarah, I think you should sit down." "What? Why?" "Dad, you're scaring me. Account number 7429 is my account. I'm the someone who's been paying your mortgage for 3 years." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "That's not possible. You don't have that kind of money. You live in a tiny apartment and work at a factory." "I lived in a tiny apartment because I was paying for your house," I said quietly. "I worked overtime shifts every week to afford your mortgage payment. I used the money I was saving for retirement to give you and Mark the home you wanted." But you never said anything. We never asked you to." "No, you never asked. You just assumed your burden of a father couldn't possibly be helping you succeed." I hung up the phone and turned it off. Tomorrow morning, they would discover what independence really looked like. My phone started ringing at 6:30 a.m. the next morning. I let it go to voicemail, then it rang again at 6:35 and 6:40. By 7 a.m., I had 12 missed calls and a voicemail box full of increasingly frantic messages. I poured myself coffee and listened to them while watching the sunrise through my kitchen window. The first few were from Sarah, her voice climbing higher with each message. "Dad, please call me back. We need to talk about this mortgage thing. There has to be some kind of mistake." Then Mark's voice appeared, tight with barely controlled panic. "Robert, I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't funny. We have 2 kids and a mortgage due. Call us back immediately." But it was the final message that told me they'd finally opened the legal documents I'd had delivered. Sarah's voice was completely different now, shaky and desperate. "Dad, please. I read the letter from your lawyer. I don't understand what's happening. It says we have to be out of the house in 30 days? That can't be legal. This is our home. Emma and Jake's rooms are here. Please, please call me back." At 8 a.m., they showed up at my apartment door. Sarah looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair uncombed. Mark stood behind her, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. Both of them looked like people whose entire world had just shifted beneath their feet. "Dad, we need to talk," Sarah said, her voice small and scared in a way I hadn't heard since she was 12 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. "I think we've said everything we need to say," I replied, not inviting them in. Mark stepped forward. "Look, Robert, I don't know what you're trying to prove here, but you can't just kick us out of our house. We have rights." I pulled out my copy of the property deed and held it up. "It's my house, Mark. My name on the deed, my money in the payments, my decision who lives there." Sarah's face went white. "But you gave it to us. You put our names on everything." "I put your names on the mailbox and the utilities," I said calmly. "I never transferred ownership. Check your paperwork." The look of absolute shock on their faces was almost satisfying. Almost. These were still my daughter and grandchildren we were talking about, even if Sarah had forgotten that relationship worked both ways. "Dad," Sarah whispered, "I don't understand. Why would you do this to us?" For the first time in months, I looked directly into my daughter's eyes. "I'm not doing anything to you, Sarah. I'm just no longer doing everything for you. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves scandal." By Thursday afternoon, 3 days after my confrontation with Sarah and Mark, the story had spread through the community like wildfire. But this time, the narrative was completely different. I was picking up groceries at Henderson's Market when I overheard Betty Morrison talking to the cashier. "Can you believe it? That poor man was paying their mortgage this whole time while they were telling everyone he was a burden. 3 years. Over $100,000 of his own retirement money." The cashier, a young woman named Amy who'd gone to school with Sarah, shook her head in disgust. "My mom always said Sarah Coleman was ungrateful, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." To throw your own father out on Christmas Eve when he's been keeping a roof over your head? I tried to stay invisible in the produce section, but Betty spotted me and came over immediately. "Robert, honey, I owe you an apology. We all do. When I heard what Sarah had been saying about you being manipulative and clingy, I should have known better. I've known you since Linda was alive, and you've never been anything but generous to a fault." Before I could respond, she continued, her voice getting louder. "Do you know what Mark Peterson was telling people at the bank yesterday? He was trying to get an emergency loan, claiming his father-in-law had tricked them into thinking they owned their house. The loan officer told my husband that Mark actually said you had been financially abusing them by not telling them about the mortgage payments. The irony was staggering. Mark was now claiming that my generosity had been abuse. By Friday, Janet Coleman had become something of a town crier for the truth. She'd been showing people the letters I'd written years ago, explaining how much I'd sacrificed for Sarah's education and well-being. At Murphy's Diner, she cornered Douglas and Helen Peterson, Mark's parents who'd been so vocal about my supposed neediness. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," I heard she told them. "That man worked double shifts for years to put his daughter through college debt-free. He sold his wife's jewelry to pay for Sarah's study abroad program. He's been living in a tiny apartment for 3 years because he was paying for your son's mortgage, and you had the nerve to call him a parasite." The shift in public opinion was swift and merciless. Sarah's colleagues at the elementary school started treating her differently. Parents who'd once chatted with her warmly at school pickup now gave her cold stares. Mark's golf buddies at the country club stopped inviting him to games after learning he'd been living in a house paid for by the man he'd called a burden. The most telling moment came on Saturday morning when I ran into Father Martinez outside the church. Sarah and Mark had been regular attendees, often making a show of their young family's devotion during Sunday services. "Robert," Father Martinez said, pulling me aside, "I want you to know that several parishioners have come to me this week, deeply troubled by what they've learned about your situation. The way you've been treated by your own daughter goes against everything we believe about honoring our parents." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've tried calling Sarah to discuss this matter, but she hasn't returned my calls. I fear she's let pride and shame prevent her from seeing the path to reconciliation." As I walked home that afternoon, I realized that the community's shift in perspective was both vindicating and sad. I'd never wanted public validation at the expense of my daughter's reputation. But Sarah had started this public narrative war when she decided to paint me as a burden who deserved to be discarded. Now the whole town knew exactly who the burden really was. The power shift became undeniable when I walked into Peterson's hardware store the following Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after I'd been humiliated in that same checkout line. This time, Douglas Peterson himself was behind the counter, and the moment he saw me, his demeanor changed completely. "Robert," he said, his voice carefully respectful, "how can I help you today?" I was there to buy paint for my apartment, finally ready to redecorate the space I'd been neglecting while pouring my money into Sarah's life. As I selected colors, I could feel the attention of other customers. Word had spread about my situation, and the dynamic had completely flipped. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store approached me while I was examining paint samples. "Robert, I wanted to apologize for how some folks in this town treated you. We should have known better. You've always been nothing but kind and generous." The most satisfying moment came when Mark's father cleared his throat behind the counter. "Robert, about what happened before, in the checkout line that day." Douglas Peterson was actually stammering. I spoke without knowing all the facts. That was wrong of me. I looked at him steadily. "You spoke based on what your son told you about me. Maybe you should ask yourself why he found it so easy to believe those lies." That afternoon, I made a decision that would cement the power reversal completely. I called a realtor and put Sarah's house on the market. Not to be cruel, but because I genuinely needed to liquidate assets for my retirement. At 72 years old, I'd spent my nest egg keeping my ungrateful family comfortable while living like a monk myself. The "For Sale" sign went up on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone was ringing non-stop. This time, I answered. "Dad, please." Sarah's voice was barely controlled panic. "You can't sell our house. Where will Emma and Jake sleep? Where will they go to school? This is the only home they've ever known." "It was never your house, Sarah," I said calmly, "and you made it very clear that you don't want me in your lives. This is me giving you the independence you demanded. But we can't afford to buy it from you. Mark's teacher salary and my substitute pay will never qualify for that size mortgage on our own." The words hung in the air. Sarah was finally admitting what I'd always known, that their lifestyle had been subsidized by their so-called burden of a father. "Then I suggest you find something within your means," I replied. "There are nice apartments across town, much more suitable for a young family building their independence." Mark got on the phone, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is cruel, Robert. You're punishing innocent children because of hurt feelings." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm simply no longer carrying financial responsibilities that were never mine to begin with. You're both adults with jobs. Figure it out." The next morning, I had 3 missed calls from a lawyer Sarah had somehow scraped together money to consult. The lawyer had apparently told her she had no legal standing whatsoever. The house was mine, the mortgage payments were mine, and the decision to sell was entirely mine. For the first time in years, I felt like the father and grandfather I was supposed to be, rather than the ATM I'd allowed myself to become. Sarah and Mark were about to learn what the real world looked like without their safety net, and I was finally free to build a life that belonged to me. The begging started on a Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the "For Sale" sign went up. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book I'd been meaning to finish for months, when I heard a car pull up outside. Through my window, I could see Sarah's Honda in the parking lot, but this time she wasn't alone. Emma and Jake, my grandchildren, were walking up the sidewalk beside her, each carrying what looked like handmade cards. My heart twisted seeing them, innocent victims in this war their mother had started. The knock on my door was soft, tentative. When I opened it, Emma immediately ran to me, wrapping her 8-year-old arms around my waist. "Grandpa Robert, we missed you so much. Mommy said you were sick, but you look fine to me." I glanced at Sarah over Emma's head. She had the decency to look ashamed. "Can we come in, Dad?" Sarah's voice was small, nothing like the confident woman who'd throw me out on Christmas Eve. "The kids wanted to see you, and we need to talk." Against my better judgment, I let them in. Jake, who was 6, immediately went to the toy box I kept for their visits, chattering about his new teacher and the dinosaur project they were doing at school. Sarah sat on the edge of my couch, wringing her hands. "Dad, I know I hurt you. I know I said terrible things. But please think about Emma and Jake. They don't understand why Grandpa disappeared from their lives." "You told them I was sick," I said quietly. "What else did you tell them?" Her face crumpled. "I told them you needed space to get better. I didn't know how to explain." She gestured helplessly. "I didn't know how to explain that I ruined everything." For the next hour, Sarah tried every approach she could think of. She apologized, she cried, she blamed her stress and Mark's influence. She promised things would be different if I would just give them another chance. "I'll pay you back," she said desperately. "Every penny of the mortgage payments. It'll take time, but I'll get a second job. Mark can tutor on weekends. We'll find a way." I looked at her sitting there, my successful daughter who'd been living beyond her means for years, finally understanding the true cost of her lifestyle. "With what money, Sarah? You just told me you can't afford the mortgage payment. How are you going to pay me back over $100,000? She had no answer. The most painful moment came when she tried to use the grandchildren as leverage. "Dad, Emma has been asking when she can have sleepovers at your house again. Jake keeps asking when you're coming to his soccer games. They love you so much." I knelt down to Emma's level as she colored at my coffee table. "Sweetheart, would you like Grandpa to come to your next dance recital?" Her face lit up. "Yes. It's next month and we're doing Swan Lake." I looked back at Sarah. "I'll be at Emma's recital, and Jake's soccer games, and every birthday party and school play they have, but that's between me and my grandchildren, not between me and you." The closing on the house took place on a crisp morning in early April. I sat across from the young couple who'd bought Sarah's former home, watching them sign papers with the excitement of first-time homeowners. They had no idea of the history attached to the property they were purchasing, and I intended to keep it that way. Tom Bradley shuffled the final documents toward me. "That's it, Robert. The house officially belongs to the Martinez family now." I signed my name with a steady hand, feeling something lift from my shoulders with each stroke of the pen. The sale had netted me enough money to secure my retirement and maybe take a few trips I'd been postponing for years. More importantly, it had closed the chapter on my role as Sarah's unwitting benefactor. After the closing, I drove to Sunset Memorial Gardens where Linda was buried. I hadn't been there in months, too consumed with the drama Sarah had created. I placed fresh flowers on her grave and sat on the bench I'd had installed there 5 years ago. I think you would have been proud of how I handled this, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to say the words. I didn't let anger make me cruel, but I didn't let love make me a doormat either. The wind rustled through the oak tree above her headstone, and I could almost hear Linda's voice telling me to stop second-guessing myself. That evening, I went through the boxes of Sarah's childhood belongings I'd been storing for years. Photo albums, report cards, awards, letters she'd written me from summer camp. I kept a few meaningful items, but most of it went into donation bags. If Sarah wanted her past, she could have asked for it before she decided I was disposable. The most symbolic moment came when I found the Father's Day card she'd made me when she was 10. On the front, she'd drawn a picture of us fishing together with the words, "World's Best Dad," in crayon. Inside, her childish handwriting read, "Thank you for taking care of me always. I love you more than ice cream. Love, your little girl Sarah." I stared at that card for a long time, remembering the girl who'd written it. Then I placed it in the donation bag with the rest. That little girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd forgotten the value of loyalty and gratitude. The final act of closure came when I changed my will. The life insurance policy that had named Sarah as the primary beneficiary was altered to establish college funds for Emma and Jake, with the remainder going to the children's hospital where Linda had volunteered. Sarah would get nothing beyond what any parent owed their child, which in her case, I'd already provided 10 times over. 2 days later, I received a text from Sarah. "Dad, I heard the house sold. I hope you're happy." I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having anymore. Instead, I texted Emma and Jake's other grandmother, Mark's mother, Helen Peterson. "Could you please let Emma know I'll be at her dance recital next Friday? I'll be in the front row." Her response came quickly. "Of course, Robert. She'll be so excited." That was the relationship I wanted to preserve, the one that mattered for the future. 6 months later, I was standing in the front row of the elementary school auditorium, watching Emma perform in her Swan Lake recital. She was radiant in her white tutu, executing each movement with the grace of a child who knew her grandfather was watching. When she took her final bow, she found me in the audience and waved, her smile bright enough to light up the entire theater. After the performance, I was making my way toward the stage when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find Mark standing behind me, looking older and more tired than I remembered. His usual arrogance was nowhere to be seen, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Robert, could I have a word with you?" We stepped into the hallway while families celebrated around us. Mark ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd never seen him make before. "I wanted you to know that Sarah and I are getting counseling," he said quietly. "Individual and couples therapy. We're trying to understand how we let things get so bad between us and you." I waited for him to continue, offering nothing to make this easier for him. "The therapist asked us to make a timeline of all the ways you'd helped us over the years," Mark continued, his voice getting smaller. "Financial support, emotional support, practical help. When we wrote it all down, it filled 4 pages. 4 pages of generosity that we somehow convinced ourselves was manipulation." He paused, watching Emma run toward us with her arms outstretched. I caught her in a hug, spinning her around as she giggled. "Grandpa Robert, did you see me? Did you see my grand jeté? It was perfect." "Sweetheart, absolutely perfect." After Emma ran back to her friends, Mark cleared his throat. "We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment across town. It's smaller, but we can actually afford it on our salaries. Sarah's working full-time now, and I've been tutoring evenings. We're learning what it means to live within our means." I nodded, but said nothing. The kids miss having their own rooms, and Sarah cries sometimes when she thinks about the garden she had to leave behind. But honestly, Robert, I think this has been good for us. We were living a lie before, pretending we were more successful than we actually were. He looked directly at me for the first time since the conversation started. "I know we don't deserve your forgiveness, I know we hurt you in ways that can't be taken back. But I need you to know that we finally understand what we lost when we pushed you away." At that moment, Sarah appeared from the crowd of parents, her face uncertain as she approached us. She looked different too, less polished than before, wearing clothes that were practical rather than fashionable. The stress of actually supporting herself had aged her, but there was something else in her expression. Something that looked like genuine remorse. "Dad," she said softly, "Emma was hoping you might come to her birthday party next month. It's nothing fancy, just cake at our apartment and maybe some games in the park, but she really wants you there." I could see the hope in her eyes, the desperate wish that this invitation might be the first step toward rebuilding what she'd destroyed. But I could also see the resignation there, the understanding that she'd lost the right to expect my automatic forgiveness. "I'll be there for Emma's birthday," I said carefully. "I wouldn't miss it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." She didn't ask for more than that. She didn't push for a private conversation or demand to know if I'd ever forgive her completely. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Sarah seemed to understand that she was no longer in a position to make demands. As I walked to my car that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. My dignity was intact, my boundaries were established, and my relationship with my grandchildren was secure. Sarah and Mark had finally learned the difference between respect and entitlement. I didn't need an apology to know my worth anymore. 1 year after that Christmas Eve confrontation, I found myself sitting on the deck of a cabin I'd rented in the Blue Ridge Mountains, watching the sunrise paint the valley below in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in decades, I was taking a real vacation. Not just a weekend here and there squeezed between Sarah's emergencies and my work obligations. The money from selling the house had allowed me to finally live the retirement Linda and I had dreamed about. I'd bought a small RV and spent 3 months traveling to national parks we'd always planned to visit together. I'd taken cooking classes, learned to play guitar, and discovered that at 73, I still had plenty of adventures left in me. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Grandpa Robert, I got an A+ on my math test. Mom says you're coming to my soccer game Saturday. Can't wait to see you." I smiled and typed back, "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'll be the one cheering the loudest." My relationship with my grandchildren had actually grown stronger since I'd established boundaries with Sarah. Now, when we spent time together, it was because I chose to be there, not because I was expected to drop everything at a moment's notice. Emma and Jake seemed to sense the difference too. Our time together felt more precious to them, more intentional. Sarah and I had reached what could generously be called a cordial understanding. We exchanged pleasantries at family gatherings, coordinated schedules for the children's events, and maintained the kind of relationship you might have with a neighbor you respected but didn't particularly trust. She'd never offered a real apology, and I'd stopped expecting one. Some wounds heal better with space than with words. The most unexpected development had been my friendship with Janet Coleman. What started as her support during my darkest period had evolved into regular coffee meetings, shared book recommendations, and long conversations about everything from politics to philosophy. At 75, she was still sharp as a tack and had a wicked sense of humor that reminded me why Linda had loved her so much. "You know what I've learned this year?" I told Janet during our last coffee meeting. "I spent so many years defining myself by how much I could sacrifice for Sarah that I forgot who I was when I wasn't being needed." Janet had nodded knowingly. The best parents teach their children to fly. The worst ones clip their wings and then resent them for not soaring. I'd been guilty of both, I realized. I'd given Sarah everything she needed to succeed, but I'd also made it too easy for her to take my sacrifices for granted. Now, watching the morning mist rise from the valley, I pulled out my journal, a new habit I'd developed during my travels. On today's page, I wrote, "Year 2 of my actual retirement begins next week. Emma's college fund is fully established. Jake's, too. The Children's Hospital has received its first donation from Linda's Memorial Fund. I have enough saved to live comfortably for the rest of my days, and for the first time since Linda died, I'm excited about the future rather than just surviving it. I paused, pen hovering over the paper. Then added, Sarah called yesterday to tell me she and Mark are buying a small house, something they can actually afford. She didn't ask for help with the down payment, and I didn't offer. Progress. The irony wasn't lost on me. By refusing to continue being Sarah's safety net, I'd finally forced her to become the independent adult she'd always claimed to be. By prioritizing my own well-being for the first time in years, I'd found the energy and resources to be a better grandfather to Emma and Jake. As I packed up my things to head home, I felt Linda's presence more strongly than I had in months. I could almost hear her voice on the mountain breeze. It's about time, Robert. It's about time. The burden I'd carried for so long was finally gone, replaced by something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope for tomorrow.